On the morning of November 19th, 1886, the thermometer nailed to the post of the Lundgren General Store in Callow Creek, Dakota Territory, read 14 below zero, and 3 families in the surrounding settlement had already burned through their entire cordwood supply. The storm that hit the night before had not been unexpected. The sky had been building toward it for 2 days, the particular greenish-yellow bruise of clouds that the old Lakota hunters read like a clock. What was unexpected, or rather what nobody had planned for adequately, was how long it would continue. 41 hours. The temperature would not clear zero for 11 straight days. But in the woodshed at the northeastern end of Ida Voss's property, the squat, peculiar, over-engineered woodshed that her neighbors had spent the better part of September laughing about, there were 4.5 cords of firewood so dry that it split cleanly down the grain with a sound like a rifle shot. Ada had stacked it herself, mostly by hand, across 16 weeks of summer and early autumn. She had started in late June, when the ground was barely thawed and the idea of winter was still theoretical. Her neighbors had watched her haul wood in July heat and shaken their heads. Waste of good summer, they said. That's not how you do it, they said. You cut in fall and burn in winter, same as always. Ida Voss was 31 years old, the daughter of a Swedish father and a German mother, and she had grown up in the river valleys of southern Minnesota, where her father, Oscar, had operated a mill. Oscar Voss had been many things, occasionally difficult, frequently right, and absolutely inflexible on the subject of firewood. He had learned from his own father that green wood burned inefficiently, that wet wood burned worse, and that the difference between properly seasoned firewood and wood that was merely chopped and stacked could mean the difference between a warm house and a cold one, or in a Dakota winter between a cold house and a dead family. He had explained this to Ida with the particular patience of a man who considered it one of the most important things he would ever tell her. Wood needs time, he said in Swedish when Ida was 9 years old, and helping him split a delivered load in August. Time and air and roof. The fire in that wood, it goes back years before you get to burn it. Everything you want from it, it needs first. She had not understood the physics. She had understood the weight of how he said it. She arrived in Dakota Territory in the spring of 1884 with her husband Anders, who died of typhoid fever in the summer of 1885, before they had managed to prove up their claim. She filed the papers herself and stayed. She was not remarkable in her stubbornness. There were other women in the territory who had done the same, and they recognized each other with a particular kind of nod that needed no explanation. What made Ida somewhat unusual was the precision of her planning, which her neighbors alternately admired and found unsettling. She began cutting firewood on June 28, 1886. This was a fact so early in the season as to constitute a provocation. The settlement at Callow Creek was small, 11 families spread across a 2-mile radius of broken grass prairie and creek-bottom cottonwood. The nearest town of any consequence was 40 miles southeast. There was a general store, a post office that operated out of the store's back room, and a church that doubled as a schoolhouse. People knew each other's business because knowing each other's business was a survival strategy, not nosiness. What Ida did was visible and, given the season, baffling. Klaus Bergstrom, age 58, was the settlement's de facto authority on practical matters. He had been homesteading in Dakota Territory since 1872 and had survived 3 of the region's notorious hard winters, 1873, 1880, and 1882. He had more accumulated experience with Dakota weather than anyone else in the settlement, which was genuine and valuable. and it had given him an abiding confidence in the methods that had gotten him through those winters, which was both understandable and, in this instance, limiting. He rode past Ida's property in early July on his way to the store and pulled up at the fence when he saw her in the woodlot with a crosscut saw, a pile of cottonwood lengths already stacked against the shed's north wall. "Little early for that," he called. "Little late, actually," Ida said. Bergstrom took this as a joke and smiled. He did not take it as a statement of engineering principle, which is what it was. He rode on. By August, when the stack had grown to 2 full cords in the structure she was building around it, the slanted roof of weathered boards, the 3-sided walls, the deliberate gap she left between the stacked ranks for airflow, had taken its completed shape. He rode past again and stopped again. "You building a house for that wood?" he asked us. The structure was not conventional. It was not, in any meaningful sense, how anyone in Callow Creek stored firewood. The typical method in that settlement was to cut in October, split in October, stack in a rough pile against the south side of the house, and hope for the best. It worked after a fashion. Wood cut in October and burned in November, and December was green, heavy with moisture carrying the unburned water content of a living tree. But it burned hot enough to maintain a stove, and the stoves burned long enough to maintain a family, and the family survived, and you did it again next year. That was the template. What Bergstrom saw in Ida's woodlot was not just an early start. It was a different theory of firewood entirely. She had built what she was already privately calling a drying shed, 16 feet long, 9 feet deep, with a corrugated iron roof salvaged from a collapsed outbuilding that she had purchased from a departing family the previous spring for $1.30. The roof was pitched at a 13-degree angle to shed rain and snowmelt. The shed had no south wall, open to the prevailing summer breeze. The north and east walls were solid, built from rough-sawn boards she'd gotten from the mill in Hendricks on credit to block the cold and wet. The wood was stacked in ranks of 18 inches, each rank separated by a 3-inch gap, the ends of each piece pointing outward toward the open south face. Cross-stacked at the corners for stability. Bark side up on every piece. Bark side up. That was the detail that stuck people when they noticed it. Elsa Krantz, age 44, the wife of the settlement's schoolteacher and a woman whose opinions carried real social weight in the community, had come with her husband to look at the shed in early August after Bergstrom mentioned it at the Sunday gathering with a tone of amused puzzlement. Elsa Krantz was not a woman who dealt in ridicule. She was too steady for that, but she was genuinely skeptical, and her skepticism was rooted in experience. "Bark side down is how my father stacked," she said, studying the shed. "It protects the cut face from rain. Bark side down holds moisture against the cut face," Ida said. "Rain hits the top of the stack, runs off the bark, and drips into the end grain. End grain absorbs water like a wick. Bark side up means rain hits. Bark runs off the edges. The end grain stays open to the air." Elsa Krantz looked at the stack for a moment. "Your father taught you this?" "He taught me that wood needs air," Ida said. "I worked out the rest." Elsa went home and re-examined her own woodpile, which was bark side down, and found that the bottom third of every piece on the ground row was holding notably more moisture than the pieces stacked above. She restacked 30 pieces with the bark up. She did not tell anyone she had done this, and she never attributed the idea to Ida in any conversation that anyone recorded. But she remembered it. That would matter later. The third voice in the settlement's informal jury of skeptics was a man named Roald Finstad, age 33, Ida's nearest neighbor, a Norwegian-born farmer with a good eye for carpentry. and a persistent belief that the simplest solution was almost always the correct one. He was not unkind. He brought Ida a haunch of venison in September as a neighborly gesture, and he looked at the shed while he was there with the professional attention of someone who builds things and notices how other people build things. "The roof will go in a hard wind," he said. "That corrugated iron wants to lift. You've got 4 pins holding it per sheet. You need 8. He was right. Ida knew he was right. She'd already been thinking about it. She'd run out of spike nails when she put the roof on and hadn't gotten back to the mill. She thanked him for saying it. He lent her a handful of 10-penny spikes from his own supply, and she spent an afternoon doubling the pin count on every sheet. "The wood itself is already drier than anything I'll cut in October," he said before he left, looking at the stack with something that wasn't quite admiration, but was in that vicinity. "It's had 4 months, Ida said. "Cottonwood season's faster than most. 6 months gets you down to around 18% moisture. October cut wood burns at 40%. 40% means you're burning water." Roald Finstad knew what 40% moisture meant in practical terms. He'd seen stoves struggle with greenwood, the glass fogging with condensation, the heat reduced by the energy spent driving off steam. He nodded slowly. He didn't say she was right. He would, later. By the end of September, Ida had 4 cords stacked and covered. She cut 2 more cords in October. Late-season wood that would be green through December but would have dried enough by January to burn well, and would be fully seasoned by the following autumn for next year's supply. This was a point that baffled her neighbors more than the shed itself. She was already cutting for next year in the middle of this year's preparation. The temporal logic of it was, to the surrounding settlement, almost aggressively foreign. She also kept a separate small stack of the current year green wood accessible near the house, not for primary heat, but as a slow-burning overnight log. A green log at the back of a firebox holds its shape longer than dry wood, burns more slowly, and can extend a properly managed fire through the night with less intervention. Mixed burning, dry wood to generate heat quickly, green wood to sustain it, was another thing her father had taught her, and it was the kind of detail that sounds trivial until it is 3 in the morning and the temperature outside is 24 below, and you do not want to get up. The storm arrived on November 18th, 1886, not entirely without warning as noted, but faster and colder than the barometric readings in Hendricks had suggested. The first hard front hit the settlement at approximately 11 in the evening, and by midnight the wind was running at 31 miles per hour out of the northwest, driving snow horizontally across the prairie in sheets that made it impossible to see the Finstad property from Ida's window, which was a distance of roughly 400 yards. By 6 in the morning on November 19th, the temperature was 14 below zero and still dropping. The settlers at Callow Creek were not entirely unprepared. Every family had some supply of cut wood. Most of them had cut in October, some in late September. The problem was that October cut wood in Dakota Territory is, depending on species and conditions, carrying between 35 and 50% moisture content. Cottonwood, which grew along the creek bottoms and was the primary firewood source for most families, was on the higher end. At 40+% moisture, a significant fraction of the stove's output goes toward boiling off water rather than heating a room. The families who had cut late were burning essentially wet fuel, and the math on wet fuel is unforgiving. A cord of wood at 20% moisture yields approximately 15.4 million BTUs of usable heat. The same cord at 40% moisture yields approximately 10.8 million BTUs, roughly 30% less. If you're planning your winter fuel supply based on the performance of seasoned wood and then burning green wood, you have already miscalculated by almost a third before the first blizzard arrives. Klaus Bergstrom's family burned through their entire supply in the first 8 days of the storm. 8 days. He had stacked what he believed was a sufficient supply, 6 cords, but his estimate had been based on previous winter's consumption, which had been calculated with wood that, while not perfectly seasoned, was at least 2 months older than this year's late-cut October supply. The efficiency gap between 45% moisture and 35% moisture is not enormous in comfortable conditions. At 14 below zero with a family of 4 and a drafty cabin, it is the difference between 6 cords lasting the winter and 6 cords lasting 8 days into the first serious freeze. On November 27th, 8 days into the storm, Bergstrom walked through knee-deep drifts to Ida's door. She answered. Astrid stood behind her, holding a coffee pot. The interior of the house was 63 degrees Fahrenheit. Bergstrom had come from a house that was, at that moment, 41 degrees and getting colder. He asked if she could sell him half a cord. He didn't mention the conversations from July and August. Ida didn't bring them up either. She sold him a full cord at a fair price, $4.50, which was the going rate in Hendricks, not the inflated price she could have commanded. And she helped him load the hand sled he'd brought by stacking the splits in 2 careful rows to maximize what the sled could carry. Before he left, he picked up a piece of the firewood and held it for a moment, feeling its weight, its relative lightness, the clean way the grain had dried. "This is not like what I cut," he said. "No," Ida said. "It isn't." She had 4 1/4 cords left. At her current burn rate, roughly 3/4 of a face cord per week for the main stove, plus a small amount for the kitchen range. She had enough to carry her well into March, past the point where the worst of the winter was likely to have passed. She had done this arithmetic in September and refined it twice, as October temperatures gave her better data on actual consumption rates. These are the kinds of stories that rarely make it into the historical record. And that's exactly why it matters that we tell them. If you're finding this account worth your time, a like and a subscription helps make sure it reaches people who appreciate these accounts of practical ingenuity. People who understand that the real history of survival is in the details. Roald Fienstad came 2 days after Bergstrom. Same request, same sled, though he was more direct about what he was asking for and why. He'd cut his own wood in late October and had been burning it hot and long to maintain warmth for his wife and 2 young children, and the efficiency of it was killing him. He was burning 30% more wood than he should have been, and he had done the arithmetic. "I should have listened more carefully in September," he said, at Ida's door. "You told me about the roof nails," she said. "That was worth a cord." She sold him a cord at the same price. Elsa Krantz came on December 3rd, not to buy wood, but with her husband Thomas, who taught school and had a methodical mind and wanted to understand the drying shed, while its results were still visible and verifiable. He brought a small notebook and asked careful questions. Ida answered them, all of them, fully and without impatience. She showed them the remaining stacked wood, the way you could feel the difference in weight between a seasoned piece and a green one. The sound the dry wood made when you knocked 2 pieces together, a clean, resonant crack, versus the dull thud of greenwood meeting greenwood. She showed them the bark-up stacking arrangement. She showed them the gap between ranks. Thomas Krantz wrote 7 pages of notes that afternoon. He would use them the following spring when he organized what he called, without any particular sense of ceremony, a practical meeting at the schoolhouse, a gathering of most of the settlement's men, at which the principles of early cutting, proper drying, and shed construction were discussed with Ida's methods as the explicit reference point. She was invited. She attended. She was the only woman in the room. She spoke for approximately 20 minutes and answered questions for another 40. Klaus Bergstrom asked most of the questions. He was not embarrassed by this. He was 60 by then and had survived enough winters to know that there was more dignity in asking the question than in pretending you already knew the answer. The winter of 1886 to 1887, the one that would later be called the Great Die-Up for its catastrophic effect on the open-range cattle industry across the northern plains, was one of the most severe recorded in Dakota Territory. Hundreds of thousands of cattle froze in the fields. Ranching operations that had run for decades were wiped out in a single season. Families across the territory burned furniture, fencing, anything combustible. The scale of suffering was immense and largely invisible to the rest of the country until spring, when the dead cattle were found thawing in the coulees and the ranchers began to calculate their losses. At Callow Creek, every family survived the winter. They were cold. Several of them were extremely cold, and one family, the Lindgren family on the settlement's western edge, spent 4 days in January living entirely in their single largest room with a fire burning continuously because they could not maintain heat in the rest of the house. But they survived. Ida's supply held through March. She still had a quarter cord left on March 15, 1887, when the first consistent thaw came and the crisis formally ended. If you've stayed with this story to its final miles, I'm grateful. Hit the like button. It takes 1 second, and it means this kind of account gets found by more people who care about it. The accounting of that winter, when people could finally sit down and reckon it, was clarifying. Bergstrom had burned through 9 cords total. His own 6-cord supply, plus the cord from Ida, plus 2 cords he had managed to source from a ranching operation 12 miles east that had liquidated its wood supply when the cattle operation collapsed. 9 cords for 1 winter for a family of 4. In a conventional above-ground structure, burning green wood at chronically high temperatures to compensate for the efficiency loss. 9 cords. Ida had burned 5 3/4 cords for the same duration. A single adult woman in her house. 5 3/4 cords. The differential cannot be entirely attributed to family size. Bergstrom's family generated body heat that Ida's single-person household did not. But body heat in a structure losing warmth as fast as an above-ground Dakota cabin doesn't compensate for 2.5 extra cords of wood. The gap was the wood. The seasoned, dry, properly stored, carefully stacked, bark-side-up wood that everyone in the settlement had watched her prepare through the summer and early autumn, with expressions ranging from patient skepticism to mild ridicule. The spring practical meeting that Thomas Krantz organized was the beginning of something that spread not through publication or policy, but through the oldest mechanism available to isolated communities: direct demonstration and shared memory. By the summer of 1887, 4 families in the settlement had begun cutting in late June. 2 of them had built versions of Ida's drying shed. One of them, the Finstad family, had built a shed that was measurably better than Ida's original design, incorporating a second layer of roofing to create an insulating air gap. And Roald had thought through the prevailing wind patterns specific to his property and oriented the open face accordingly, rotating it 15 degrees from due south to capture the dominant summer breeze more directly. He showed Ida the revised design in August. She examined it carefully and borrowed the double roof detail for her own shed's second construction phase that September. This is how practical knowledge actually works, not as a single invention handed down from a single inventor, but as a running conversation between people who are paying close attention to the same problem. The principle Ida had applied, that wood must be cut and dried long before it is burned, that moisture is the enemy of heat, That time and airflow are the inputs that no amount of burning effort can compensate for afterward, was not new. It was not original to her father, or to his father, or to the Swedish farmstead tradition from which it came. The same understanding appears in virtually every cold climate culture that has worked with wood as a primary fuel for long enough to develop a formal tradition around it. In rural Finland, the practice of cutting wood at least one full year before burning, 2 years being considered ideal, has been documented as far back as the 17th century. The Finnish word for properly seasoned firewood, kuivapuu, carries connotations not just of dryness but of patience and preparation, a word that implies the wood has been given what it needs to become what it should be. The Sami people of northern Scandinavia developed methods of stacking and covering wood in ways that maximized airflow while protecting against the specific precipitation patterns of the subarctic, designs that arrived at similar principles through entirely independent observation. In Japan, the preparation of firewood for traditional bathhouse operations, the Sento culture that shaped Japanese domestic life for centuries, involved multi-year drying protocols and specific storage architectures that would have been recognizable to Ida Voss had she known of them as solutions to the same problem. The problem being, heat is not in the wood. Heat is in the wood after water has left it. Everything else is just how you move the water out before winter arrives and makes that impossible. The drying shed Ida built at Callow Creek in 1886 no longer exists. The property changed hands twice before 1910, and by the 1920s, the land had been absorbed into a larger dryland wheat operation. But the principle it embodied, the idea that the preparation for winter begins in late June, not in October, that dry wood is not a category of wood, but an achievement that requires months of deliberate, unglamorous effort, that principle became, over the following decade, the dominant practice at Callow Creek and in several of the surrounding settlements.